Good evening, friends. It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. We are going to continue reading Heroism Begins with Her. So we began with the Revolutionary War, moved into the Mexican-American War, and then moved into the Civil War. Now we have a new kind of soldier, women in the Spanish-American War and World War I. So a bit of background on the Spanish-American War. It took place from April 21st, 1898 to August 13th, 1898, so it was only a few months long. The Spanish-American War was fought in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, between the United States and Spain. The battle began with America intervened in the Cuban War of Independence. The war resulted not only in Cuban independence from Spain, but also in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands, becoming American territories. The United States entered the fighting after the USS Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor, Cuba. A little background on World War I, 1917 to 1918. World War I, also called the First World War, the Great War, or the War to End All Wars, was the first global war. The fighting followed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which set off a diplomatic crisis across Europe. It lasted from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. The United States entered the war in 1917. More than 70 million soldiers took part, and more than 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians died worldwide in what proved to be one of the deadliest conflicts in history. The high death count is due in part to the fact that weapons of war had become more technologically sophisticated with the creation of barbed wire, machine guns, tanks, and poison gas. World War I was politically significant because it resulted in the demise of the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. National boundaries were redrawn in Europe as part of the peace process. Now, our leading ladies. After the Civil War, the country needed time to heal. The fighting between the North and South devastated families and communities, and it took many years to recover and rebuild. The next major military engagement, the Spanish-American War, was not fought until the close of the 19th century in 1898. During the Spanish-American War, the military finally began to recognize that women could play an important part in a professionalized nursing corps. Congress authorized the Army to hire female nurses and pay them $30 a month, but these women were not given military status or benefits. From 1898 to 1901, almost 1,600 women served as military nurses in the United States at U.S. bases around the world and on hospital ships. But despite the efforts to improve sanitation and establish good medical practices, the working conditions were poor for nurses. Typhoid fever spread quickly through the camps and infected both soldiers and healthcare providers. Ellen May Tower of Byron, Michigan, holds the unfortunate distinction of being the first Army nurse to die on foreign soil. She died of typhoid fever while serving in Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War and before Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory. Her body was returned to the United States, where she also became the first woman to receive a military funeral when she was buried in her hometown in Michigan. After the Spanish-American War, the official role of women in the military began to drastically change for the better. And while it was a slow change, improvements were being made. Leaders in the armed forces started to see the value of a trained professional nursing staff, and they moved to make female nurses a permanent part of the military. In 1901, the United States established the Army Nurse Corps, and in 1908, it established the Navy Nurse Corps. The women who served as military nurses wore uniforms and were attached to military units, but they were still considered civilians. They didn't have rank, and they didn't receive retirement pensions or disability benefits, even if they were injured in the line of duty. During World War I, more than 21,000 women served in the Army Nurse Corps, and 1,500 more served in the Navy Nurse Corps. And for the first time, women worked in non-nursing jobs too. The Navy began to need additional help with its clerical and administrative work. So in 1916, Secretary of the Navy Joseph Daniels famously asked, "Is there any law that says a yeoman must be a man?" A yeoman is an enlisted soldier in the Navy who does administrative or clerical work. After checking the regulations, an officer told Daniels that there was no such rule. And in that moment, Daniels made a decision that would change the role of women in the military. He decided to allow women to join the Naval Reserve. In 1917, the first women joined the Navy. Most did clerical jobs, but some worked as radio operators, electricians, pharmacists, photographers, telegraphers, fingerprint experts, chemists, torpedo assemblers, and camouflage designers and other skilled non-combat positions. These female soldiers received the same pay, $28.75 per month, and the same veterans benefits as men. This proved to be a huge step forward in welcoming women into the military, and the idea caught on. During World War I, the Navy employed 11,274 female yeomen. In 1918, the Marines also began enlisting women in non-combat roles. Ultimately, 305 women joined and served the Marine Corps Reserve during World War I. On the home front, women who did not serve in the military also found new economic opportunities. Many took jobs left open when men went to fight in the war. The rate of employment among American women increased from 24% in 1914 to more than 40% in 1918. Many of these women worked in what had been considered male jobs, such as postal workers, police, firefighters, bus and tram conductors, and bank tellers. In many cases, women did the same work for half the wages paid to men. New jobs were also created to support the war effort, such as line jobs in munitions factories. In fact, the demand for weapons made munitions factories the largest single employer of women in 1918. With so many men pulled out of the workforce to serve in the military, there was no choice but to allow women to work non-traditional jobs. Canaries in a factory. The women who worked in munitions factories often handled TNT, an explosive chemical that caused their skin to turn an orange-yellow color. These women, sometimes called canary girls because of their skin discoloration, often worked with these poisonous chemicals without protective clothing or masks. Many experienced nausea, skin irritation, and liver damage. The problem was particularly bad in England, where at least 100 women died during World War I from exposure to TNT and factory work. What are the reserves? The reserves are military units made up of trained soldiers who continue with their civilian lives and careers, but they are on call to serve if needed. Reservists receive the same basic training as full-time soldiers, but they return to their homes and their private lives rather than going into active duty. They spend 1 week in a month plus 2 weeks a year training with their unit. They typically serve for 3 to 6 years. So Edith Ayres and Helen Wood were the first enlisted women to die in the line of military duty. Genevieve and Lucille Baker were twins who were at the ready to serve. Heather Voorhees Hansen, Army, Army. Lene Higby, the Navy's nurse. Opha May Johnson, the first female Marine. Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee, creating a professional nursing corps. And Loretta Perfectus Walsh. a new kind of soldier. Loretta Perfectus Walsh helped to redefine the role of women in the military. When she enlisted in the Naval Reserve on March 17, 1917, she became the first woman to serve in the armed forces as anything other than a nurse. Loretta Walsh was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1896. As a young woman, she carefully followed the global events that contributed to the beginning of World War I. International tensions grew in March 1917 when a German U-boat attacked American ships, killing 15 Americans. The situation became more heated when the military ordered that American merchant ships be armed and ready to fight if they encountered the U-boats. As these events were unfolding, Walsh learned that the Navy was going to change its policies and allow women to enlist. And on March 17, 1917, they did. The Navy Department opened its ranks to women, and 20-year-old Walsh was the first to heed the call. She signed on a 4-year enlistment as a yeoman. The titles for female recruits got a bit fuzzy, which enlisted as a yeoman, F for female. But female yeomen were sometimes called yeomanettes or yeowomen. Female yeomen performed clerical work, serving as typists, stenographers, bookkeepers, accountants, telephone operators, and inventory control experts. Other females in the Navy became radio operators, electricians, draftsmen, fingerprint experts, and other technical specialists. Several weeks after Walsh was sworn in, Congress declared war. The United States joined World War I. More than 11,000 women served in these and other roles in the Navy. While the war with the Germans ended on November 11, 1918, Walsh and other female yeomen continued to work for several months longer. But by the end of July 1919, a month after the Treaty of Versailles officially ended World War I, the female yeomen were decommissioned because they were no longer needed. Walsh remained on inactive reserve status until the end of her 4-year enlistment. Walsh suffered from a serious case of the Spanish flu during the pandemic of 1918. A few years later, she developed tuberculosis. She died on August 6, 1925, at the age of 29. Next up, one of my favorite wars to discuss. It's our War II. Women in World War II. You thought World War I was the end of all wars. World War II, 1939 to 1945. It was fought between the Allies, including the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, China, France, Poland, Australia, and Canada, among others, and the Axis nations, Germany, Japan, Italy, among others. It involved more than 30 countries and left 50 to 85 million people dead. It began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939. At the same time, Japan tried to dominate Asia and the Pacific, opening up the Pacific Theater, another area of fighting. When the war ended, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two world superpowers. After World War I ended, women turned their attention to a different battle, the fight to be recognized as full citizens by gaining the right to vote. After more than 70 years of campaigning for suffrage, women finally got the right to vote in 1920. Women's work during the war, both in the military and at home, made it difficult for legislators to dismiss women's call for suffrage. After a great deal of public pressure from women in the suffrage movement, President Woodrow Wilson finally decided to support women's right to vote. In an address to the Senate in 1918, President Wilson said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" Later that year, Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote, and in 1920, it became law after 2/3 of the states ratified the amendment. The changes with women's role in society didn't stop with suffrage. In the period known as the Roaring Twenties, many women rejected traditional female roles and embraced the modern era. During this time, more Americans moved to the cities and the nation grew wealthier. People bought cars, telephones, and electric appliances as part of the emerging consumer culture. This period of prosperity abruptly ended with the stock market crash of 1929, which triggered the Great Depression and defined the 1930s. After struggling through a decade of economic despair, the economy began to recover and the nation went to war. And once again, women were a critical part of the military mission. During World War II, it became clear that women could and should play a significant role in the armed forces. Military leaders didn't experience a sudden change of heart about women. Instead, they experienced a basic manpower shortage. Every man was needed on the front lines, so women were brought into the military to fill the non-combat positions that had once been assigned to men. Free a man to fight became a rallying call for women in all branches of the armed forces. While women were not considered for combat roles, they did take on a number of jobs that would have once been considered inappropriate. In addition to clerical and administrative work, they were now allowed to work in more technical roles, such as mechanics, pilots, and electricians, as well as skilled work such as postal workers, parachute riggers, and many other jobs that did not directly involve fighting. One by one, all the branches of the armed forces opened their doors to women. Each had a different name for its recruits. Women's service during the war proved that they had a lot to offer the armed forces. The thousands of women who volunteered were essential in keeping the military running smoothly. Even though women did not engage in combat. 16 female soldiers were killed by enemy fire during the war. Women who did not join the military also supported the war effort by joining the civilian workforce, just as they did during World War I. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of women in the workforce increased from 27% to 37%. Many of these women worked in the aircraft industry and as munition workers. Rosie the Riveter, the strong red bandana-wearing factory worker, became a national icon of women in the workforce. Both men and women did their part. This was America's war. In case you never don't know who Rosie the Riveter is, this is she. You have to check out Miss Pascogan's desk. She has a giant poster. All right, and a shout out to Bea Arthur. Some of you might be familiar with her. Probably not. More of my generation and before. But she was an actress, and she was a star in sitcoms, including The Golden Girls. And she spent 13 months in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, working as a typist and a truck driver. She enlisted in 1943 at the age of 21. At the time, her name was Bernice Frankel. She was promoted to staff sergeant and honorably discharged in September 1945 at the end of World War II. One of my kiddos that I adore and I babysit for was named after Bea Arthur. There's the Angels of Bataan serving to the end. They were a group of Army and Navy nurses who were imprisoned in Santonia Thomas internment camp during the war. Margaret Burke White was the first female photographer for the Army. Her co-workers at Life gave her the nickname Maggie the Indestructible because of her bravery and willingness to go into dangerous situations. Jacqueline Cochran, a record-shattering career. Colonel Jacqueline Cochran sits in the cockpit of a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, In 1971, she became the first woman inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in Dayton, Ohio. Carmen Contreras Bozak, the first Hispanic woman to serve. Dr. Margaret Craighill, yes, we can. She traveled 56,000 miles over 9 months to report on the conditions of Army nurses and female service personnel. In recognition of her service during the war, Dr. Craighill was awarded the Legion of Merit. Susan Ann Cuddy, the first Asian American woman in the Navy. The Freon siblings, Ralph, Philip, and Susan, all served in the United States military during World War II. Charity Adams Early, you've got mail. Major Charity Adams Early inspects the members of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion. She was sworn in member of the Navy Nurse Corps. Annie G. Fox, cool undercover. Lieutenant Annie G. Fox was the first woman to receive the Purple Heart for her service during the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. At about 8 a.m. on that day, hundreds of attack planes filled the sky, and the USS Shaw exploded during the Japanese raid. Joy Bright Hancock riding the waves. Yvette Hobby setting a new direction. Grace Hopper, Amazing Grace. She was the head of the Navy Programming Language Section of the Chief of Naval Operations. Aldous E. Lutz, Fearless in Flight. Elsie Ott, Bringing Nursing to the Skies. The Air Medal to Second Lieutenant. The Flight Nurse's Creed, Claire Phillips, Jennifer MacArthur's Spy. Reba Z. Whittle, The Silent Prisoner of War. On September 27, 1944, Second Lieutenant Reba Z. Whittle looked out of the C-47 she was flying in and saw one engine in flames after being hit by enemy fire. The plane crashed, and the survivors crawled from the burning wreckage, only to be immediately captured by German soldiers. Whittle was grateful to be alive, but terrified to be held captive. She became the only female prisoner of war in Europe during World War II. Reba Zatella Whittle was born August 19, 1919, in Rock Springs, Texas. She studied at North Texas State College and the Medical and Surgical Memorial Hospital School of Nursing in San Antonio. In 1942, she enlisted in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps as a second lieutenant. She almost didn't make the cut. At 5 feet 7 inches tall, she weighed just 117 and 7 pounds below the weight minimum. The recruiter allowed her to join, but encouraged her to put on a little weight. Whittle served in hospitals in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Sacramento, California, that began training as a flight nurse on the Bowman Army Airfield in Kentucky. Several weeks after completing the 6-week training, she flew to England to join the 813th Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron. Whittle flew on 40 missions and logged more than 500 hours of flight time between January and September 1944, when her plane was shot down. After they were captured, the surviving crew members were taken to a nearby village and treated for their injuries before being moved to a hospital. Because she was the only female prisoner of war, the Germans weren't sure how to handle her. She was taken to a military hospital where she worked taking care of burn patients and amputees until the military negotiated for her release. She returned to the United States on January 25, 1945. When Whittle got home, she was asked to sign an agreement with the military that read in part, "I understand that all information concerning escape, evasion from capture, and details of imprisonment or release from internment is secret and must not be disclosed. I realize that publicity concerning my experiences will endanger the lives of many persons, and therefore it is my duty to take all possible precautions to prevent it. She never discussed her capture or wartime experiences, even with her family. Whittle was recognized for her wartime service. In 1945, she was awarded the Purple Heart and the Air Medal, and she was promoted to first lieutenant. Later that summer, she married Lieutenant Colonel Stanley W. Tobiason. She asked to be released from active duty and was discharged from the military in January 1946. Unfortunately, Whittle was unable to put her wartime trauma behind her. She suffered from physical and psychiatric problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder. She had to argue with the military to receive disability compensation and retirement pay benefits. Whittle died of cancer in Sacramento, California on January 26, 1981, at the age of 61. Frances Wills, Harriet Pickens, and Mildred McPhee, Free Who Dared. And then we will pick up with Here to Stay, Women in the Korean War.